University. She's going to be speaking on AVs and the ballet of the street.
So I want to talk today with all of you about autonomous vehicles and what Jane Jacobs calls the ballet of the street. This improvised choreography of interactions between people moving in the public right-of-way, but what in its less gracious and easy interactions might better be described as the battle of the street. I'm talking here in this talk, this is a side note, as if the car has its own agency, but I mean to symbolize in that this is an amalgamation of economic interests represented by the auto industry together with the will of drivers as expressed through politics. So since the car was widely integrated into urbanity, it has demanded and been given the majority of the right-of-way, and this dominance has been normalized. In practice, the dominance of the car in the right-of-way is governed through a complex negotiation between the rules of the road and the exceptions and interactions on the street. The rules of the road are embodied in stoplights, pedestrian crossings, sidewalks separated from the road, speed limits or allowances, and separated bike lanes, for example. The exceptions and improvisations are the jaywalking, the stalled vehicle, the delivery van parked in the bike lane, the sharrows, or the right turn on red, the door opening into the flow of traffic, and the children who aren't paying attention. When an old person walks too slowly across an intersection to complete the crossing before the light changes, usually drivers will wait. Most of the time, these exceptions and improvisations result in real-time adjustment that keeps everyone safe, but not always. And it is in this complex improvisation where the reality of the implied violence and threat of force that enforces the rules of the road are felt, especially by those not protected or wrapped in a ton of steel. But although the car dominates, there is some agency left to non-drivers in this combination of rules and contract governing road interactions. So my question today is, what happens to this negotiation for the right-of-way when cars are driven by AI? When the car becomes essentially a robot equipped with sensors and governed by algorithm? This is a thought experiment. So in this thought experiment, just another note, I'm going to assume that the AVs don't make any errors. And we know that, you know, we've heard the stories of where there have already been fatalities with AVs. But so I'm going to assume in this thought experiment that if they are programmed to stop for people, we will assume that they will. So in the first part of this thought experiment, what happens? Okay, so the other part of the thought experiment is that all cars are AV, or are robot cars. So that's taking a leap ahead, obviously. So what happens in that case? In the first part of the thought experiment, the result is an increase in the degrees of freedom for non-drivers, a kind of reclaiming of the streets by the slower modes of transportation. Here's the scenario. AVs are programmed not to hurt anyone. A person is walking. She gets used to the idea that cars will stop for her. She generally follows the signals, but gradually relaxes into the new trust of the robot's algorithm. No one honks if she lingers in the street. She allows herself to daydream for a moment. She is crossing the street with her young children. She no longer hustles them with rising vocal warnings to hurry up and watch out as they scoot across the intersection. Then they, in turn, unlearn their rigorously enforced habit of stopping at all points of the sidewalk that are interrupted by roads, now continuing their easy roll across the openings of side streets. A person steps out to cross the street without worrying about the distant car fast approaching, knowing that it will sense him from a distance and slow down. People get tired of waiting for so long for a light to change and cross on a red. A cyclist, accustomed to risking her life on a routine basis, and that might be one of the reasons for the gender imbalance in cycling. Squeezing between parked cars. Okay, thank you. Squeezing between parked cars and fast-moving vehicles, hands on the brake in case someone opens the door, eases ever so slightly into the flow of traffic as she begins to understand that cars zooming up from behind will sense her and give her adequate berth. People living without cars in the apartment buildings, lining fast-moving suburban arterials, are suddenly free to cross to the mall without danger of fatality or major traumatic injury. People inadvertently or deliberately unlearn their instinctual fear of traffic as they experience degrees of freedom on the public right-of-way, unprecedented in their lives, their parents' lives, or even their grandparents' lives. In the language of Foucault, the technologies of self-governance change. It becomes less coerced as discipline by force or implied violence is replaced with discipline by algorithm, and the algorithm is forgiving and generous. So what happens then? Many more people feel safe enough to bike. Walking becomes more pleasant and comfortable. Cars slow and stop at busy times, idling in gridlock and inching along at the mercy of the person on foot and the cat crossing the road. The only places where the flow of automobiles speeds up is on separated grade highways, where the cars flow smoothly along in blocks of convoys at an even pace with the same distance between each vehicle, or at night when the streets are mostly empty of people. In the day, and especially at rush hour, traffic slows to a crawl. Vision zero is achieved at the cost of a massive shutdown of automobile speeds. Every street is a complete street without the need for infrastructure redesign. The hierarchy of road users is successfully flipped. Buses and streetcars also become even slower than they already are. Perhaps people riding in cars get angry. Perhaps the mayor announces a police ticket blitz on pedestrian violations, but it doesn't have the same effect as the original fear of getting run over, and they can't be everywhere at all times. Perhaps transit priority lanes are given to all surface transit routes so they at least are untangled from car traffic, if still subject to those moving on foot or by bicycle. Perhaps these walkers and cyclists generally still voluntarily follow the rules of the road. In places where this is difficult and makes life almost impossible, such as on super blocks with no pedestrian crossing, where desire lines are thwarted by the barrier of fast-moving traffic, perhaps the new normal holds. Perhaps these desire lines are then formalized, jaywalking is no longer illegal, and the priority of the streets are extended to the person on foot. This would similarly have major implications for urban form and accessibility, as you all know, as the suburban areas are spread out and depend on the speed of automobiles to connect people to destinations in reasonable amounts of time. Perhaps major mode shift is finally achieved as people ditch their cars and take transit, which is faster, and walk or bike where possible. Perhaps. But maybe not. Maybe it's decided by whom and how, and I'll leave this to your imagination, that the automobile need flex its power and reclaim its central place on the street. How is this to be achieved? I actually don't like to dwell on this possibility. It's been so lovely to imagine with you the generous robot cars. Because if it comes to the revenge of the robot cars, this will, which is what I really should have called my talk, this will necessarily involve killer algorithms. Now, this might sound dramatic, but think about it. The first part of this hyper-disciplining scenario would involve the further erection and strengthening of barriers, both physical and regulatory, backed by police power as they now are. Fences are put up along suburban avenues between intersections. Bicycles are forbidden from sharing roads with cars. Jaywalking shifts from a bylaw infraction to a criminal offense. In places where it is impossible to separate modes of traffic so completely, then perhaps they become permanently pedestrianized. The city zone, The suburb zone, on the other hand, is given back more completely than ever to cars. If physical and legal barriers prove not enough, then cars will not be programmed to switch between the perhaps between the defer mode to the go mode. And in the go mode, they don't stop. So that's my thought experiment. Maybe it's overly dramatic, I don't know. But I find what's lacking in this literature is this kind of like public grappling with the implications of AVs, and a kind of reflection on the history of the street and how the automobile has dominated it and what it means if AVs are introduced in a big way. And so, I haven't done a research project on this, but there is a new colleague of mine at McGill who I just met called Jung Moon. She runs a robot ethics lab. So we've just started talking about perhaps what kind of research could address this. I don't know that it's going to be a central part of my research agenda. Right now I'm working on zoning stuff, but I just wanted to put this out there because I think it's probably important about how we structure our discourse as researchers and in the industry to acknowledge that this is not solely an engineering problem, that there is a social context and a public space, and there's major implications. And just to give you an example of what I mean by this is that here's a paper. When I was teaching a transportation class for the last 3 years at the University of Toronto, and it was really fun. And Matt Palm's going to do it now. But one of the papers I assigned was this. And here's a sentence from the abstract. This is one of the papers that got me thinking about this. And when I was teaching about AVs, I needed to teach a little bit about the future of the car. Because autonomous vehicles will be risk averse, this is someone who ran a game theory idea about what would happen, right? Because autonomous vehicles will be risk averse, there's your good robots, the model suggests that pedestrians will be able to behave with impunity, and autonomous vehicles may facilitate a shift towards pedestrian-oriented urban neighborhoods. So at the same time, autonomous vehicle adoption may be hampered by their strategic disadvantage that slows them down in urban traffic. But I don't think this has been thought out far enough. And I also wonder about the language of like behave with impunity, as if the pedestrians are a subject to be disciplined, which obviously we are, because that's what happens every day on the streets. But I just wanted to ask this question, and actually, surprisingly for me, in this little thought experiment, I expected it to be really like horrifically dystopian. But then when I actually thought it through, that it was that first moment of like renegotiation of movement in the streets where I thought there's actually some potential for interesting things to happen here that might not all be bad. So yeah, thank you.